There is a moment when the sun disappears, when darkness falls, and you're left with just your fears. That's the moment you feel your first pang of doubt. That's the moment when the night comes out.
Episode 9, Mythos, Part 3. For most, the line between fact and fiction is undeniably clear. People often distinguish early on whether something is too outlandish to be believed. But what happens when a group of people believe something so strongly that it blurs the line between fact and fiction? For the detective in this tale, no amount of preconceived beliefs can save him from facing the truth when the night comes out. Chapter 23, Retreat. I drove and it seemed to take forever. The snow continued to fall. It took all of my concentration just to stay on the road. I had no idea what time it was. It seemed like there was no one on the roads and no one anywhere. I felt lost in a gray world where there was just ice and snow and grayness and nothing else. I felt as though I had crossed over into some dimension where everything Adam believed was all too real. Outside, the world seemed less and less civilized. I knew where the retreat was, but I had no recollection of where I was or how close I was, and could not have told anyone how I managed to get to the gates of the retreat. One moment I was crunching my way slowly over the snow, and suddenly I was there. The retreat was surrounded by a huge line of hedges. The hedges were now almost a solid wall of white. Beneath that white, the snow that had fallen previously was frozen, caked with ice, and almost as hard as concrete. There was an iron gate with the name of the retreat arching across the wrought iron bars. The bars, the arches, and even the name of the place was completely caked in snow. Through what I could see through the bars, I could just make out what was beyond. There was a huge empty courtyard. During the late spring and summer, it must have been a gorgeous garden. I could see paths running between areas that must have held flowers of all shapes, colors, and sizes. In the distance was a gigantic mansion. It reminded me of something you might see at some Ivy League university. This must have been the main hall of the place and where Adam lived. Disappearing into the gray was a lot of grassy fields that ran between small cabins. The cabins were quaint and probably quite adorable in the sunlight and against the blue skies, but they looked small and dark and menacing in the gray. Each cabin was surrounded by hedges and bushes. All of them were covered with snow, and the houses looked almost buried. Right now it looked anything but warm and welcoming. Around me on all sides were trees and forests. The road was empty both behind me and ahead of me. I knew that not too far away was another North Shore Chicago suburb, but right here it felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. I also knew that the empty land ran all the way down to the lake. I could imagine the lake looking cold and gray and angry right now, as if hideous and hidden things lay beneath it. I drove past the gate and found a place beside the road where I felt I could pull over far enough. I hoped that a snowplow would not come through and hit it, but from the looks of the road, this place had seen few plows during the entire winter. The cold hit me in the face and sent me back into the driver's seat for a moment. Then I braced myself and stood. My legs were cramped and my hands hurt from gripping the steering wheel. I braced myself against the car and then reached back inside to grab the shotgun. I looked at the huge white wall in front of me and sighed, my breath puffing out into the cold air. I walked around the front of my car and walked up to the snow-covered hedge. I reached out to touch the snow. It was hard and frozen. It was as if someone had been running water over the snow to make it even harder. I pressed more firmly and heard a soft cracking as the snow gave way. I stood back and puzzled over things for a moment. I heard nothing coming from the other side. No one inside the compound seemed to be out in the snow. I could see smoke trailing into the gray sky from the main building. Someone had lit a fire in the fireplace. I stepped back up to the hedge, and I kicked near the bottom with my shoe. I soon had a place for my toe in the ice and snow. I stepped up to experiment. It held my weight. I kicked another place in the snow and stepped up again. I was only a few inches up, but it was holding my weight. I took the shotgun and quickly hurled it over the top of the hedge. I heard a soft thump on the other side. I then pushed a handhold into the snow. Slowly, I began to climb up the hedge. I kept waiting for the entire wall to collapse, but it didn't. I moved as fast as I could, pulling with all my might as I reached the top. I swung my leg over, sitting in the snow and ice piled at the top, and then dropped into the snowdrift on the other side. I heard a huge thud from the other side and realized at that point that the section I had feared would collapse finally did so. I quickly found the shotgun and then hid low in the snow. I waited to see if someone would come running at the sound of the ice and snow falling. My face was getting numb and my fingers felt frozen stiff before I felt capable of moving. I moved low and crunched through the snow. I kept my eyes on the cabins to my right. I felt as if I were the only person in the world. The silence seemed absolute. In the distance, and it seemed ridiculously far, I could hear the lapping of waves from the lake. The large house looked rather inviting. I could see the smoke from the chimney. I could see that there were lights on downstairs and one light on in the upper right corner. I moved as quickly as I could, given the snow that, at times, came up past my knees. I headed toward the left side of the building, away from the lighted windows. I finally reached the edge of the building and crept along the wall. I would take a step and then listen. Then I would take another step and then listen. I moved this way, my face losing all feeling in the seemingly constant wind, until I reached a door. It was wooden, without a window, with an iron latch that you pulled out to open the door. I reached out with my gloved hand and pulled slowly. To my surprise, the latch pulled. I opened the door slowly. I cringed when the door creaked. It seemed impossibly loud to me in the pure silence of the compound. I pulled the door open and then crept inside, shutting the door behind me quickly. The darkness of the room made me freeze as my eyes adjusted. I felt helpless and breathed rapidly and listened. I heard nothing. My eyes eventually adjusted. I was in a kitchen. Chrome appliances sat dimly before me, and granite countertops looked gray and menacing. I could see a block filled with knives. I moved slowly, feeling as if my footfalls were as loud as cannons as I walked across the tiled floor. I paused at the doorway. I heard voices. They were soft and far away, but one of them was very obviously Adam. I could recognize his voice in a crowd. I held my breath and strained to listen. I could not make out any words. I gripped the shotgun and moved forward. I was now on carpeting. I was silent. Inside, Adam waited, and I had things I needed to discuss with him. Chapter 24. Confrontation. I moved forward, my feet whispering across the thick carpet. The metal of the shotgun on my hand felt cold and hard. I realized I was shaking. I realized I hadn't even fired the gun at another person. The rooms were huge and empty. I passed one darkened room after another. Inside each room there were tapestries and statues and other strange things, but there was little furniture. It was as if Adam had just moved in. I heard his voice droning on in some distant room. I still couldn't make out any specific words. I felt as if my breath was louder than anything else on the planet. I rounded a corner, and I saw a room in the distance, a soft glow flickering. A shadow threw itself against the far wall, and I could see it was a figure sitting in a high-backed chair. I could start to hear words, but it didn't make any sense to me. Whatever language Adam was speaking, it didn't sound like English. I pressed up against a wall and began to creep towards the open doorway. On and on the voice droned. The words were an abomination to any known language on the planet. Strings of consonants that should never have been strung together flowed off of his tongue. I heard paper rustling, and then the words resumed, and I pictured Adam turning the pages of a huge book. I wondered if he was simply reading aloud, or was he recording this? I had my suspicions that he was recording this for his followers. "The time has come," he said. "The world is a festering hole. It is time for the great old ones to return. It is time for them to wipe the planet of the disease that is known as man. It is time for those of us who serve them to sit by their side as they enslave the human race and destroy this foul planet. We have polluted the world. We kill each other for the slimmest of reasons. We do not deserve to rule this world. We deserve to either be destroyed or serve the true masters of this domain. The time is close, and the world will be theirs. We shall serve by their side as humble servants, and they shall lift us to exalted places." I crept closer to the door. I could hear the crackle of a fire over the droning of his voice. I felt sweat drip down my forehead and into the corner of my eye. I realized I was breathing louder and that my heart was pounding. I had no idea what I was going to say once I got into the room. Part of me supposed that I would just shoot. Then how would I get out of this place? How many of his followers was I willing to kill? "The time draws nigh even as I speak," he continued. "In fact, the talisman is coming to me as I record this. It will be in my hands soon. From then, we will find the book that shall lead us to the ways we shall bring back the old ones." I was at the edge of the doorway. I pulled the gun up to my chest and tried to calm my nerves. Then, I turned into the room, pointing the barrel towards where I hoped Adam was sitting. He was in the room. There was indeed a fireplace, and it was behind him. However, the chair was now facing the doorway. Adam sat there in his white suit and his beatific smile and glasses. He had a microphone in his hand, and beside him was a tape recorder. I had no idea how the chair had turned. As soon as I saw him, my head began to swim. I felt as though something was crawling inside my brain. "Good evening, Detective," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming. I wish the snowstorm had not delayed you as much as it did. I had expected to have this happen this morning. I guess not all things can be known to us." He reached over and shut off the recorder. I tried to pull the trigger. I found that my finger was unable to bend. It was like some giant hand was holding me still. He continued to smile. "You brought the talisman, I presume?" he said. I found myself nodding. Then I felt myself reaching into my pocket and pulling the small rectangular stone from it. I tossed it to him, and he caught it in midair as it tumbled towards his lap. He nodded and stared at it. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said as he turned the stone over and over in his hands. "You touched it, didn't you?" I nodded. He put the talisman down on the table next to him. For the first time, his smile faded. "Charles," he said. The man with the glasses suddenly stepped into the light of the fire. The fire shimmered and reflected off of the lenses of his glasses. Sweat was beaded across his forehead. "Hello," he said. Then he stepped forward and seemed to cover the space between where he was and where I was in seconds. I tried to move, I tried to run, I tried to defend myself. I found I was unable to move. "This will go much easier if you relax," Charles said. "I'd listen to him," said Adam. Charles stepped up behind me, and suddenly one arm was against the back of my head. The other arm was around my neck. The air cut off. I gasped. I stared at Adam. He was smiling again, and had picked the talisman up again. "Sleep," he said. "We'll talk later." I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The room became wavy and hazy. Then there was blackness. I could see Adam's face smiling at me as the world went from gray to black. Chapter 25, White Room. I had no idea what time it was or how long I was out, but when I opened my eyes, I saw only white. For a moment, I had this thought that maybe I was dead. Then my eyes focused, and I realized I was staring at a fluorescent bank of lights and that I was lying on some small cot. The walls were white as well. I had a monster headache. I sat up slowly and held my hand to the back of my head. I sighed and then moaned. I ached everywhere. I looked around the room. There was a small white cot that I was currently sitting on. The floor was white tile, the walls were white, the ceiling was white. There was a toilet in one corner, and it was made of metal like something out of a jail cell. Then there was a wooden door that had no window or doorknob.
"I'm glad to see you're awake, Detective."
Adam's voice came through a speaker pressed flush against the ceiling. I looked up and saw that there was a small black dome in the middle of the ceiling. I assumed that behind this dome was a camera. I stared at it. "Where am I?" I asked.
"You're in the basement of my home. You know, the one you invaded while carrying a shotgun,"
he said.
"You won't be staying here too long, however. I think you have now outlived your usefulness to us."
"Why not just kill me then? Why lock me up?"
"We found what looked like the talisman in your pocket,"
the voice replied.
"We had to check to make sure it was the real thing. We've confirmed that it is. Now we will be able to make it look like you entered my home with intent on doing me harm. I am technically within my rights to shoot you. Oh, you have to love this country."
My head was buzzing. I had this vague feeling that my life was in danger. I couldn't really fully remember how I had even gotten here. I wondered if they had drugged me after they had knocked me out. "How long have I been out?" I asked.
"About 4 hours.
The voice said. I nodded. "So, you know how that talisman works, right?" There was a strange pause.
What do you know about it, Detective? Don't try playing any games. That talisman can only be used by someone very special. Take someone with an open mind. I'm sure that's not something you possess."
I nodded again. "And it's supposed to show you where that book is, right? How exactly?"
"It gives those who are gifted a vision,"
the voice said.
"It shows them what the book looks like and where it is."
I sighed and lay back down on the cot. I knew I should have been afraid, but I felt very calm. I felt tired. I felt like I could go back to sleep. "So you're gonna shoot me? Not very sporting."
"Yes, I know. However, it is the quickest and easiest way to get this over with. I can promise you it will be quick. It's the least I can do."
"Would you like to know what happened to me when I touched that talisman?" I asked. There was another pause.
"I told you not to play games."
I ran my fingers over the etchings. I saw your book, written in blood, with the cover made from human flesh. Am I close? This time, the pause was much longer. Then there was a loud click. Then there was another click, and I thought I heard someone say something, but I couldn't tell what it was.
"How do you know that?"
he asked.
"Only a select few people know what the Necronomicon looks like. How?"
I shrugged. "I just saw it, but hey, you go ahead and kill me." There was another click.
"You are proving to be a most frustrating person to deal with, Detective."
Suddenly, there was a strange hissing noise. I sat up suddenly and sniffed the air. Then the wall became blurry, and my head felt light. "You bastard," I slurred. Then I fell over, unconscious. Chapter 26, Meal. I awoke, and my mouth tasted as if my tongue had been removed and replaced with old shag carpet inside a fraternity house. My eyes were blurry for several seconds. When they became less so, my brain still refused to believe what I was seeing. I was sitting at a huge dining table. Around me were numbers of empty chairs, and down at one end sat Adam. He was still in his white suit, and he still had that infuriating smile on his face. In front of me was food in such abundance and that smelled so good that my mouth started watering immediately. "Now you want to feed me?" I asked. Adam laughed. His laugh was like gravel in a metal container being rattled by a lunatic. I felt sweat running down my back. "Apparently I misjudged you in many ways," he said. He reached down and grabbed what looked like a turkey leg and bit into it. "I guess I thought you were not the creative type. You'll have to forgive me. That was my own prejudices coming out. I guess I didn't realize your ability to put together things in a way that would lead to solutions to your cases took a certain type of creativity." "I see," I said. I moved my arms forward and was surprised to find that they responded. I picked up what looked like a piece of roast beef and shoveled it into my mouth. It was the greatest roast beef I had ever eaten. "You have to be creative to get the talisman to work?" Adam nodded. "So it seems. Lovecraft knew that. There are some that think he may have seen what you saw, perhaps with another talisman. There have been many over the years. This is just the one we felt we could find the fastest. But it seems that the creative mind is the only one able to receive the transmissions the talisman gives out." I nodded. I was barely listening. I reached out and grabbed more food. I had stuffed a hot dog, a hamburger, and some rolls into my mouth in a shockingly short period of time. I had never been so hungry. "Slow down there, detective," Adam said. "We don't want you to choke." He let me eat for a while. All the time, he slowly shoveled food into his own mouth. He ate like a bird from what I could tell. At some point, I realized the guy with the weird glasses had entered the room. He seemed to circle the table as if Adam had sent out some kind of mental signal. I barely noticed. I was still shoveling food into my face. When I finally stopped, I wiped my chin and made a feeble attempt to wipe crumbs off of my shirt. Then I belched loudly. Adam smiled. He reached calmly into one of his pockets and then tossed something on the table. It bounced and clattered across the wood, leaving tiny pockmarks as it tumbled, and then came to rest in front of me. It was the talisman. "I'd like you to pick up the talisman and see if you can get it to feed you visions again," he said, in a tone so quiet and conversational that he might have been asking me about football scores. I shook my head. "No." Adam nodded. "I thought you might say that. I wanted to be civil with you. I know that the drugs we were using on you would make you very hungry. I also knew that you might be resistant. However, I will tell you now that no matter what, you will end up doing what I ask. One way or another, you will pick up the talisman and run your fingers across the engravings. You can do it now and we can enjoy some fine dessert, or you can be tortured for days." He paused. His voice never wavered. His eyes had that strange Santa Claus twinkle. He folded his hands in his lap and crossed his left leg over his right. "What will it be?" I looked at the man with glasses. He seemed to mimic Adam's smile and then slowly walked over until he was right behind me. He reached out and grabbed my left hand tightly. His grip was like iron. He lifted my hand off of the armrest of my chair and placed it on the talisman. It felt alive beneath my hand, as if it were squirming. "Please," I said. I tried to put fear in my voice. It wasn't difficult to do, as I was absolutely terrified. "Just do it," Adam said. "What you are privy to is something most of us would kill for. Well, to be honest, most of us have killed for." I clutched my hand around the object. It felt like stone and yet was harder than even any kind of stone. It looked like obsidian. It was so black, but it was not. It was like nothing of this earth. I clutched it so that a portion of it was sticking out from the end of my fist. "Fine," I said quietly. The guy in the glasses let go of my hand. However, he stood right next to my chair. I looked up at him and gripped the talisman tightly. "Sorry," I said. Then I stood up and smashed the end of the talisman into the man's face. The stone shattered the bridge of his glasses. He opened his mouth to yell, and I hit him again, the hard stone-like edge smashing his teeth and sending them down his throat. He coughed and gagged. Blood ran out of his mouth and out of his nose. I pulled my hand back and hit him hard on the bridge of his nose, driving upwards with the talisman held flat in my hand. The man said. The bones in his nose crunched audibly. The force of the blow drove the fragments of bone up into his brain. His eyes, normal and blue beneath the reflective glasses, grew wide. Then they grew unfocused. Then he fell straight down to the floor. I looked down at his form. Some part of me realized I had just killed a man with my bare hands. I looked over at Adam. If I expected to see fear, I was sorely disappointed. He was merely shaking his head. Such a shame," he said. "He was a good man. Sit down." I opened my mouth to say something in return, but there was something about his eyes. My head began to swim again, the way it had when I first saw him in his study. The strength seemed to go out of my legs. I sat back down. I still held the talisman, now covered with blood. "It was necessary," he said. "I hated to sacrifice him, but the talisman needs blood sometimes." I opened my mouth. No words came out. Then I nodded. I held up the talisman in front of my eyes. I watched as the blood smeared across it seemed to disappear into the mysterious stone. "See," Adam said, "your every move since the very moment you learned of its existence has been choreographed. You have been led here because it is your destiny. It is your destiny to help us bring the old ones back. You can accept that, or you can die screaming as you try to deny it. Whatever you choose, you will do your part." I looked into those maddeningly calm eyes. I sighed. Then I ran my thumb across the etchings set into the talisman. Chapter 27, Vision 2. The visions hit me even faster the second time. Suddenly, it felt as if I was rushing through the upper atmosphere of the earth. I saw the clouds rushing past me, and I felt the wind against my cheeks. I was pushed back against the tall, hard back of the chair I was sitting in. I let out a small cry. I barely heard Adam lean forward eagerly. I rushed through the emptiness of space. Planets and stars rushed past me. I felt nothing now. I barely breathed. It felt like I flew forever. Then slowly, the rushing slowed and began to fade out. Ahead of me was a planet that appeared so dark it was almost black. It was like approaching a blemish on the face of the universe itself. I descended. Nightmares began assaulting me, rushing past me as I began to descend. They were monstrosities of unspeakable horror. They had wings, but they were not wings for flying through atmosphere. These were wings made to guide upon solar winds and across solar systems. They had claws and scales and looked like dragons and demons and every sort of nightmare from the very beginnings of humanity. Still, I fell. I fell and I rushed forward. Beneath me were cities unlike anything that had ever existed on my own planet. Huge, towering buildings made from living rock were there, and within them, life existed. It was a blasted, monstrous life. Creatures of every size and shape and manner were running around beneath me. Animals with stars for heads, animals that were part vegetable and part animal. All of them were worse than any demonic description. They moved and fought and they lived. It was like looking into the very portal of hell. Then, I came to him. I had seen him before, sleeping in his den beneath the oceans of Earth, but this was a glimpse into the past. This was him as he ruled his own planet. He stood there, towering, his legs deep in the ocean, and still his upper thighs were visible above the waves. His tentacled face twitched and writhed. He held sway. He was their spiritual leader, and the lesser monstrosities worshipped around him and beneath him. Many of them swam through the cold, blasted, and poisoned water. And I knew then what the true horror was. Cthulhu might have existed as the ultimate horror, but he was not the top of the food chain. No, he was merely the high priest. As horrible as he was, there were others higher and more horrible than he. These were beings who had barely any real existence, but existed more as thought, as mist, than as something tangible. These were beings who saw all around them as if they were things with which they could play and devour at their whim. And what was more terrifying was that Cthulhu, as in my first vision, saw me. He was somehow looking into my mind, showing me this vision. He was showing me how things were and how they would be again once he was awakened. And then the vision changed. I saw the book, the horrible book with the cover made from human flesh and pages that resembled something like flesh. It was like flesh dried and pulled tight, riddled through with veins that had once held blood. The ink itself appeared to be blood, but if it was the blood of humans or monsters or both, I could not be sure. In places, the words ran together, becoming smears, and most of the writing was in strange symbols that looked written by alien hands. I saw where it was. I saw that this abomination existed and was real. It was hidden. However, it was reachable, and it was on planet Earth. It was buried far below the surface, beneath the base of a mountain, but it was still there. It could be held. It could be read. It could be recited and chanted and sung. I knew then, with full certainty, that reality was less than paper thin, and that in places, it was less than that. I knew that when those words were spoken, the old ones would awaken. I knew that the creature Cthulhu would arise and he would destroy much of the planet. I knew that those that remained would become slaves, and that then, only then, would he summon those for whom he had served all those thousands of years. Then the earth would be consumed. The planet would run red with the blood of every living thing. Then the planet would become a barren, dead thing. All would then be silent. Chapter 28. Exhaustion. We talked for a very long time. From time to time, Adam would press the talisman into my hand and instruct me to touch a different part of the black rectangle. My fingers would run across a tiny etching that I could just barely feel. Then my body would sit bolt upright as if I had been shot through with electricity. Then I would see more visions. I would see more nightmares. I don't know how long this went on. It seems likely that it was only a few hours, but it seemed like days. Adam's face would suddenly float into view with that infuriating smile. He talked in his soft voice, and I would nod and respond. His voice seemed to fill and echo through my head. I have no idea what I was saying to him, but it seemed to please him. He patted my head, and that smile grew bigger. He patted my hand as if comforting me. I barely remember what he told me. I barely remember any of the visions I had. I know that I saw other planets and other dimensions. It seemed as if the thing that we know as reality is truly as thin as paper. At places and during certain times, those places are even thinner than paper. There are creatures that we cannot see lurking just outside of our vision at all times. They serve masters more horrible and horrifying than the worst nightmare you have ever had. I know because I saw them, and they were more terrifying than any nightmare I had ever had. They created us, you see, or at least I think they did. They came to this planet when it was still a ball of molten lead, and the stardust was still settling from the Big Bang. They planted seeds and ran experiments. They needed servants. They needed creatures that could adapt to the atmosphere they had created. They needed us, but then we got too big. The atmosphere of the planet changed, and we became smart. We became a possible danger, and they retreated. It was a war that we fired without a shot, and yet was more horrifying than any war fought by humans. I saw that my life had been a lie from the day I was born. I began to realize that everything that I thought of as real was just about as substantial as smoke in a high wind. Nothing was real, and all that we believed were lies. There was no death and no life, and only them. They sat there, behind walls that we could not see and they could only feel, and twitched their fingers and things happened here. They were dormant, no longer walking the face of the planet, but each of the old ones was aware. They were so terrifyingly aware. It was like pulling back the curtain of your living room window and seeing an eye the size of a mountain staring back at you. I thought of ants. I thought of them scurrying about in their little ant farms. I thought of children grabbing those pieces of plastic and glass and shaking them, laughing maniacally as the carefully constructed tunnels and rooms collapsed. Then staring in amazement as the little ants began over again, clawing and crawling their way out of the dirt to create them all over again. I realized that this was what humans were. I ate again. I drank. Adam talked. He talked and he talked. He seemed tireless. He told me how someone had shown him the truth of the world. He told me that he was taught about the old ones and that he had once sat in a state similar to my own. Then he had embraced it, and since then, he had been able to perform magic. He used the term magic. There were times when he could read thoughts, he said, and hear a leaf falling to the ground from a tree on the other side of the world. He served them, and he had been rewarded with power and peace like he had never known. "The world is falling apart now," he said. "The world is falling into tiny pieces. Humans are fighting over everything from scraps of land to health care. People no longer debate. Meanwhile, the animals are dying and the planet is getting warmer. The oceans are so polluted that no one can swim in them. The time has come. The time has come for the old ones to return and wipe this planet clean of the disease known as man." He came close to me then and clutched at my arm. I could smell the sweetness of his sweat. I could see the beads of sweat on his forehead. I could smell the meat he had eaten for dinner. "Those of us who serve them will be rewarded. We will not be destroyed. We will be their slaves, yes, but we will also be witness to the wonders and majesty of the universe. Things that you cannot imagine will be revealed to you. Perhaps then we shall be further rewarded, maybe with a planet of our own. Imagine that. Imagine going from slave to master and with the entire knowledge of the universe tucked away in your brain." He smiled widely. His teeth were so even and so white. "You are very special," he said. "Many others have tried, but only to you does the talisman reveal its wonders. You have no idea how special you are." He sat back down and sipped out of a glass. I forgot if it was wine or maybe it was blood. "You would be a welcome addition to our family," he said. "You could be one of us. You could sit with us at their right hand. You might even be exalted among all of us." I found myself nodding. My eyelids felt heavy. I muttered something, but I have no idea what I said. "I understand," he said. "You must rest. We will have so much time to talk about this some more." He smiled and waved his right hand. Things went dark. Chapter 29. Out. I don't know how many days I was in a kind of haze and that Adam kept talking to me. I lost track of time and barely was able to hold on to any of my consciousness. My head felt like lead weights most of the time. I wondered if I was awake or asleep. I woke in what I felt was the middle of night, and I was back in the small room with the cot and the camera in the ceiling. I had just had another marathon session in the dining room with Adam. I had had more visions of monsters and beings that my brain hurt to try and comprehend. I felt as though I had been punched repeatedly in the head. My mouth was dry. I sat up and looked around. The door was open. It was very obviously open. I heard nothing from anywhere inside the house. I looked up at the camera as if that would tell me something. I could almost feel Adam's eyes watching me. I looked again at the open door. It was obviously a trap. I felt like a rodent poking around at the cheese in the trap. I sighed and slowly stood up. My head immediately began to swim, and the world went out of focus. It slowly shifted back into focus. I ran my hand over my face and felt what I assumed was several days' growth of beard. I wondered again how long I had been out of it. I looked again at the camera mounted in the ceiling. It stared back as though it were some unblinking doll's eyes. I walked toward the open door. I stepped into the hall. It was well lit, and it was empty. "What are you up to now?" I whispered. There was no response. I wondered if it was still snowing. I wondered if it was spring. I had no idea of anything. The entire world seemed unreal to me. It felt like decades since I had driven up to this place. The world that Adam had been talking to me about seemed more real to me at that moment than the one covered with snow. I walked down the hall. I heard nothing. I smelled nothing. No one came rushing. I heard no alarms. I walked up a short flight of stairs and recognized the hallway. I walked across the hardwood floors and across the carpeted areas. I headed for the front door. I reached the front door and paused. I expected the door to shock me or for someone to come running. I expected anything but the absolute nothing that greeted me. I reached out and turned the knob. Again, there was nothing. I opened the door and was blasted by ice-cold air. Outside, the world looked as if it had been buried in snow. The sky was a horrific slate gray. The wind cut through me like a knife and I shivered. Then I looked to the right and saw that there was a coat rack. On it was my jacket, and that was it. Again, it could not have been a more obvious trap. I grabbed the jacket and put it on. I pulled the zipper all the way up and turned the collar up against the wind. I stepped out onto the porch and breathed the outside air for the first time in days. I stepped down the first step and then the next. I reached the bottom of the front porch and looked at the mounds and mounds of snow around me. It looked like an alien world. I looked back at the huge house behind me. I had come here to get revenge for my friend. I had come here to stop this man and what he was doing. Now all I could think about was running. I wanted to sprint through the mounds of snow and find my car. Of course, I realized that my car might be long gone. The wind blew up and the chill cut through me again. This time, however, faintly, like whispers in a distant room, I heard voices. I held my breath and listened. Yes, there were people, and they were making noises. It had a strange, rhythmic quality to it. I stood there in the wind as snow blew around me. My teeth chattered. The wind blew again, and again I heard the voices. They were coming from somewhere near the lake. That was off to my left. I looked back at the house. I looked out across the frozen expanse of the grounds of the riding retreat. I knew that I could probably just start walking and head right through the gates and out. Then what? Where would I go? How would I even get there? They seemed to have no trouble finding me. I turned to my left and was soon knee-deep in the snow. Several times I stepped into mounds that were even deeper, sending me in up above my thigh. I was weakened from the days of constant interviews with Adam, yet I managed to lift my legs higher and continue on. The sounds of voices grew louder. I realized that there was singing and chanting. I shuddered and realized I was not cold, but frightened. I lifted my legs and forced them on. The wind was cutting through me, sapping the last of my strength. Again, I wondered if I shouldn't just try to run for it. Maybe I could find my way to a major road and flag someone down. Then again, I thought as I looked around, there would probably be little traffic with this snow. I had to know what was happening. I had to see. It was something inside that was pushing me on. All of the things I had seen over those days made me wonder. I had to know what was out there. I had to see. I collapsed against a tree. It was white and covered with snow, like some kind of skeletal hand reaching out of the ground. I breathed in and out in great gasping breaths. The wind hurt my lungs. I listened to the strange singing and chanting. It was in a language I did not understand. Then I heard something else. I heard a scream. It was louder and more intense than the singing. It pierced through me and then echoed off of the houses around me. It was filled with terror. It was female. I stood up from the tree and tried to run. Chapter 30. Revival. I scrambled through the snow. The wind bit at me like something alive, tearing through my jacket and nipping at the bare skin beneath my clothing. It tried to sap my strength more as I moved forward. Snow filled my shoes, seeping down beneath the socks and soaking my feet. I felt snow shoving its way up the legs of my pants and down the waistband. Still, the sound of singing and chanting grew louder. There had been no further screams, but the memory of them still sank deep into my soul. I could not shake the feeling that I knew who the screamer was. There was that stark familiarity to it that made me move forward. My head still felt like it was spinning, and I couldn't form thoughts easily. The wind seemed to fill all the world with nothing but its icy breath, and I couldn't process anything. Instinct drove me on, powered my legs through the snow, and kept them moving even as I sank to my waist in snowdrifts. Eventually, I crested a hill and looked down to see what, during the summer months, must have been a beach. Now, in the cold and the gray skies, it looked gray and dead. Beyond it was ice that stretched into the lake. The ice undulated and moved with the sluggish waves of the lake. Beyond the ice was the gray, moving lake itself. It went on and eventually merged with the gray skies. It was like looking at the skin of something dead and diseased. I stopped and tried to catch my breath, the cold air tearing down my windpipe and scraping the inside of my lungs like fingernails. Standing on the beach was a huge white tent. It was the kind of thing that you might see at a wedding, or, in the back of my mind, a tent revival. I had the feeling it was currently being used for that second purpose. I could hear the chanting and singing. The noise would stop and I could just barely make out, over the howling of the wind, a singular voice speaking. I cocked my head to the side to listen, and could make out the soft but commanding voice of Adam. I felt again that I should turn and run. However, I had taken so much time getting this far, it seemed wrong to just flee. Plus, there was that scream. There was that scream that seemed so familiar. So I pushed on. The rest of the way was not so hard. I could not understand the words that the people inside were chanting. It was some language that I am sure had died a long, long time ago. Sometimes it sounded as if they were grunting and making noises like animals. As I got closer, I could feel heat radiating from inside the tent. The opening of the tent faced the lake. I worked my way around the outside of the tent. There were no windows, just solid white fabric that flapped and whipped in the wind. I put one hand out and ran it along the fabric, feeling the heat from the inside. The song seemed to have no end. Every so often it would pause. I could hear Adam speaking in another language that I also could not understand, and then they would all start singing and chanting again. I kept expecting to run into someone, perhaps someone standing guard. However, there was no one. I rounded the side, facing the full force of the wind, and my skin felt as if it were made raw and red from the cold. I kept onward, moving toward the lake. I looked up and saw the grayness of the water as it undulated and moved in a strangely sensuous manner. Far out into the lake, I could see small white caps as the waves were kicked by the wind into levels that would make any boat a miserable experience. The tent seemed to go on for a long time. I trailed my hand along the fabric. I had a strange and random passing thought. It was that of the fictional whale Moby Dick. I suddenly felt as though the tent were as large as that mythical animal, beached here on the shores of Lake Michigan. The thought made me laugh, and I wondered, not for the first time, if I had completely lost my mind. I suppose that I had. Very little made sense to me anymore. I rounded the far side and found the opening. Again, it was unguarded. It was like I was in a trance. I moved forward and reached out, grabbing the edge of the tent flap. I could feel the heat from inside as if it were a portal to the tropics. I could smell something burning in there. I thought perhaps it was incense. I pulled the flap aside and stepped in. The chanting came to an immediate stop. I stood in the open flap and felt the heat from inside. Sweat broke out on my forehead almost immediately. It took me several moments to take in what I was seeing. There must have been 24 people inside. I had seen some of them during my days when Adam had been talking to me, and I had been in a kind of haze. They were dressed in white flowing robes, and they had been moving in some kind of strange rhythmic dance. The ground was sand, and the heat from their movements, plus the lights that had been placed around the tent and were strung high in the air on scaffolding, had made it soft again. It was like stepping onto a beach in Hawaii. Beyond them, toward the far end of the tent, was a stage. It had been built high. The tent itself somehow seemed larger inside than it had initially appeared outside. My head swam. The heat at the front of my body seemed to collide with the sheer biting cold at the back and created a kind of storm in my head. I felt myself stagger and caught myself by grabbing the flap of the tent. Adam stood on that stage. He was, as always, dressed in white. Sweat covered his face and made him look as if he had been glazed. When he saw me, a wide grin spread over his face. "You made it," he said. I tried to open my mouth. I tried to run. I tried to do something, but I couldn't move. My head was swimming again. I bent over and retched, feeling for a moment that I was going to vomit into the sand. However, it passed, and nothing came up. I spat into the sand and stood. Then I noticed what was next to Adam. I realized what that raised platform really was. Atop the platform was a raised beam. It was supported on both ends by other beams. Dangling from the crossbeam were 3 ropes. Each rope ended in a loop. Inside those loops were the necks of 3 people. "No," I whispered. I wiped sweat from my eyes. It took me a minute to realize who was in those nooses. Tracy, my secretary, stood at the far left. Her eyes were wide and frightened. She had a gag in her mouth. She was naked, her hands and feet bound. Sweat dripped from her skin. It was her that I had heard screaming. Next to her was the detective. He was naked as well, also gagged and bound, and appeared to be unconscious. Next to him was Candace, Adam's former lover. She was like the other 2, including nude and bound. She was awake, but blood ran from some kind of wound on her forehead. She also looked scared, but there was something else behind her eyes. It was as if this was what she ultimately expected. "You're just in time," Adam said. "Make room for our guest and welcome our newest member." Those around me surged forward. They extended their hands. I pulled back at first, but their hands grabbed at my own. They pulled me forward. I saw only eyes and faces. They were smiling. Their eyes seemed glossed over. They were in some kind of trance, covered in sweat and glowing with the kind of religious ecstasy of the truly mad. They pulled me forward. "No," I said. In my mind, I had screamed it. In reality, I had barely raised a whisper. My coat was torn away. My shirt was ripped open. I was pushed forward, the grinning face of Adam becoming larger and larger. I tried to fight, but I was losing. I had no strength. I could only see Adam, feel the fingers and hands pulling and pushing me forward. I could see Tracy's terrified eyes pleading with me, but I was helpless. I stopped fighting and let them carry me. "You are here to do what you must do," Adam said. "You are here to sever your old life and become something new. You have been shown the reality of things, and now you must give yourself over to us and to them. You must become one of us, and there is only one way to do that." He gestured, a sweeping thing with his right hand, and indicated the 3 people standing at the gallows. "You must make a sacrifice," Adam said, and smiled. Chapter 31. Endings. I stood on the stage and my knees felt weak. The chanting had resumed, and Adam's face seemed to grow before my eyes until all I could see were those glasses and his wide, insane, eager eyes. Sweat was pouring down his face like he had been doused with a bucket of water. His smile seemed a mile wide, and I feared his entire head would open and he would swallow me whole. "You must make a sacrifice," he said. His voice was quiet, and I was able to hear him distinctly despite the noise of the chanting. It felt like he was in my head as well as speaking. "The old ones require it. You have been hearing the truth of the world, the truth of the universe itself for days now. You have seen them. You are truly exalted among all of us. You are certain to sit at the right hand of Kalulu, the high priest. You are nearly one with Yog-Sothoth, the keeper of the gate. Hail Yog-Sothoth, the people behind me chanted. I had heard these names repeatedly over the last few days. I still barely understood what any of it meant. I had seen them with my own eyes, that is to say, with my mind's eye. They had haunted my dreams, and each point I touched on the talisman had revealed another creature more horrible than the last. Many of them had almost no bodies at all, and yet were more terrifying than Kalulu with his face of squirming tentacles. All of them were from other worlds and other dimensions, and each of them had some hand or tentacle in the very creation of the human race. All of this had been made clear to me. All of them were just a tissue paper's width away from our own dimension. They slept, but they were aware. They were so terrifyingly aware of everything. They're stirring, I heard myself say. Adam nodded, and his grin somehow got wider. Yes, they are. They are stirring because their time is nearly here, isn't it? I nodded. And we can make it their time. Adam nodded again. Yes, once we have the book that you found when you touched the talisman. Inside that is the key that can tear down the walls of this dimension into the dimension of the old ones. They will awaken when we recite the words and perform the rituals, and they will come marching through. We shall soon have the Necronomicon. The Necronomicon. I heard several of the people behind me whisper the name reverently. I looked at them, and they were swaying. They held their hands out to me in supplication. I was something special to them, because when I touched the talisman, I could see. None of them could see. You were part of them, Adam said. Somehow, some part of you is connected with them. We have been searching for you as much as we have been searching for the book. Yes, they all chanted at once. I felt weak. My knees felt weak, sweat poured down my face. I had never felt so hot. I felt like I was burning inside. I turned and saw the terrified eyes of Tracy. Her eyes were huge and open wide. Sweat poured down her body as well. I tried to feel something for her. I tried to feel something for all three of them. Instead, I thought about the world and how it was. I thought about the wars that were raging even as I stood there sweltering, being worshipped throughout the world. I thought about the melting ice caps and the heating planet. I thought about the greed of humanity. I thought about all of those hurting, maiming, killing for the sake of religions that I had just learned were more false than the boldest lies. The truth was enough to drive anyone mad. The truth was enough to wipe all of that out. What use would wars be over scraps of land when the world realized that there were beings out there who could destroy them all with a thought? What religious zealot would want to blow themselves up when they realized that creatures far larger than the tallest skyscraper were the real reason any of us were here? I can't, I whispered. It was weak, barely a whisper. I was trying to hold on to my own mind. I could feel the world tidling beneath my feet. I could feel the eyes of countless creatures. I wanted to fear them. I had feared them when I first saw them as I touched the talisman. Now, however, the fear was not there. I felt something else. I felt like I was home. We have missed you, I felt them say in my head. The countless creatures that lived on planets and within dimensions that turned and twisted in on themselves like countless snakes chasing countless tails. Their faces, those that had them, were terrible, and they were also strangely familiar. You can, said Adam. He took my hand and led me to a spot on the stage. I reached out with a hand that did not feel like my own and gripped the handle of a lever. Let them go, I pleaded. You must sever your old life, Adam said. It is part of the process. To become one of us, it must be a sacrifice that means something. I tried to conjure the face of my friend Carl. I was unable to remember what he looked like. Who was he? Did he matter? Did any of it matter? The world was a sick, twisting cesspool, and I could help change it all. All wars would stop. Nothing would matter save the fact that the old ones were once again awake. The entire universe would shake. And where would I be? My heart felt large inside my chest. I looked again at the 3 naked human beings with their necks in nooses. Tracy was pleading with me. I could see her lips moving around the cloth gag. She was crying. The police detective had his eyes closed, the skin around them swollen and bruised. Candace looked at me with tired eyes. She closed them and then nodded. She wanted it to be over. "I can see," I whispered. "I've always been able to see." "Yes," Adam whispered in my ear. "You can see because you are connected to them. You have barely touched your potential. Pull that lever and become one with us, and see how much still awaits you. There is so much we can do together." I knew I should fight. I should turn and punch Adam and then try to fight my way through the throngs that were chanting, humming, and swaying below. I could see them waving their hands and chanting like human waves. They were so eager for me to pull the lever. Their eyes were the essence of madness, and yet I felt something for them. "Sacrifice," Adam whispered. The whisper was soon picked up by the others. Over and over again, the words echoed in my ears. I looked once more at Tracy. She was shaking her head. I had shared so much with her. She was truly my last link to my old life. She had never hurt another soul in her entire life. She had made me laugh countless times over the years when I was down. She was always there with a smile and a good word. She always said that kindness would win out. However, she had no idea of what I had seen, or of what the world was really made. She could not see. She was, in short, not one of us. "Sacrifice," I whispered. I pulled the handle. Epilogue: The Future. It has been months since I made my sacrifice. Much has changed. I'm currently sitting in front of my computer at my office as I type this. Outside, the world is once again becoming gray with winter. I have learned so much more since those first few days. More importantly, I am able to do things that I never dreamed of as possible. I cannot possibly explain what is about to happen to the world. It will be changed in ways that will seem subtle at first, and then everything will happen quite fast. The great old ones will appear, and many of them are so large that, well, it would be hard not to notice them. In short, Earth's time is nearly over, and the time of humanity is about at an end. It only took a few months to find the book, you see. Once I put aside my old life and was truly able to see, I learned fast. It all came back to me. I realized I had lived many times and was connected at a deep level to the old ones. Of course, you may read this and decide I've been brainwashed. You can think what you want. If you want to think I murdered 3 people who were close to me in order to devote myself to some cult, you can think that. No one will likely ever read this anyway. The world is about to change. The universe will tremble. I think that we may go somewhere else and create more people. The universe is bigger, more terrible, and more violent than you can possibly imagine. I can imagine it all. I've seen it all, and I'm not afraid of it. The old ones will be here soon. I can almost feel them on the other side of this reality. They are waiting at the gate. I can help them get through. I know it now as certainly as I know that I am sitting in this office. Kalulu Fatagan. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, a weekly horror anthology podcast with stories by Brian W. Alaspa and narrated by Ali James. For Brian's work, visit his website at www.brianwalaspa.com or visit amazon.com for his books of fiction and nonfiction. Be sure to listen to Ali's work on Facebook at Ali James Projects.